Hey everyone, in today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Romain Basset on the show, and today we are talking about the top 5 spear phishing methods used in both the enterprise space and a category containing all companies. And so this episode is the result of some internal research we did here at Hornetsecurity, where we looked at the top 5 spear phishing methods used in each of these category areas, and there were some very interesting findings. And the findings were so interesting that I looked at these and I'm like, you know what? We should probably do a podcast episode on that. So that's what we're covering on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornetsecurity. As always, I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and I've got Romain Basset on the show with me today. How's it going, Romain?
Hey, hi, Andy. Hello, everyone. I'm good. How are you?
Doing good. Hey, I think this is your 4th or 5th appearance. I don't know. I've lost track at this point. But for those people that may not know who you are, can you give us a quick introduction of yourself and what you do for Hornetsecurity?
Absolutely. Thank you once again. So I'm Romain. I've been working in the cybersecurity field for the past 15 years now. And at Hornetsecurity, I'm responsible for the technology strategy team. And so our goal is to explain to our customers out there, our partners, the advantages of our solution technologies, as well as share the latest insights from our security researchers on threat intelligence and cyber attacks.
Sounds good. And you know, that aligns perfectly with kind of what I had in mind for this episode. And I guess as is the theme that I've been doing here for the last month or two now, I've kind of organically been starting every episode with a story of some sort. And like, it's not on purpose, but that's just the way it's been. And so this particular episode kind of came about from some research that you and I were doing for a different project. We were looking at what are the most popular types of spear phishing currently, right? And that came about, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, and we looked at, if I remember correctly, like a 3-month period.
Yes, exactly.
Throughout the summer of 2024, for those folks that are watching this or listening to this episode in the future. Anyway, when we looked through the list, we compared 2 different things. We looked at just large enterprises and what the statistics said, and then we also looked at all businesses, which included large enterprises as well as the SMB, the mid-market, et cetera, et cetera. And there were some interesting differences, right? And a couple of surprising things. And so I started looking at this. I'm like, you know what? This would be a really interesting podcast episode to not only talk about what the top spear phishing methods are, how they work, what people can do about them, but to also talk about why there are differences from the enterprise space to the other businesses, right? So what I wanted to start with here, Romain, is initial contact fraud. And a lot of people don't know what initial contact fraud is. And basically it is a message, a spear phishing message that basically is a prompt for the target to respond back, right? So for example, if somebody gets an email that says, hey, are you available to hop into a meeting? And that's the message, right? And the idea there is that, you know, the user's gonna, well, no, I'm not available. By the way, who are you? Well, it tells the threat actor that this is a live address and there's a person responding on it, right? Amongst other things. And typically it turns into more communications back and forth. And eventually a pretext is built. And then eventually the threat actor will go after what they're trying to get, right? Have you seen any particularly interesting ones that you can think of, Romain? I know generally that's kind of how most of them work, but not all of them, right?
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the first point I like to share is that how this demonstrates an evolution in spear phishing, right? Spear phishing, one could say, is a fairly recent threat, right? And initially, a lot of them were like obvious, very direct wire transfer requests. And as people get trained and are made aware of those attempts, spear phishers, cyber criminals have evolved. And one of their techniques has become to use those intro emails or intro text messages as well impersonating senior level or C-level, and under false pretext saying, "Hey, I'm stuck in meeting all days. I can't take a call. I need some help. Are you available?" And I found this approach really interesting because they are trying to establish some sort of relationship, to establish
Yeah.
credibility. So that's an interesting trend because that's also a way for cyber criminals to kind of weed out as well their target list, right? Oh, 1 out of 10 responded. That's the one I'm going to go for. And the other thing, and we were discussing that actually before the episode, is the fact that in the US you can receive those over text messages. And I didn't think much about it initially, and then it reminded me something. Somebody from our team actually received CEO fraud. So sorry, an initial contact email impersonating our CEO back in the days in the US. So one way or another, that cybercriminal got access to this employee's personal phone number, as
Right.
well as understanding he was working with the company and that was the company CEO. So I found this approach really, really interesting. And once again, showing how advanced and crafty cybercriminals are
Right.
now.
Right. And I mean, the smishing portion of that, and if folks aren't familiar with what smishing is, it's phishing over SMS, basically, right? Anyway, the smishing portion of this I find really interesting as well because sometimes the initial contact fraud SMS message is as simple as "Hey," a single word, "Hey." Like, oh, we're buds. Like, I'm just saying, hey, and I mean, the idea there is that a lot of most people are going to, well, pay yourself. Who are you? I don't know who you are. Like, and again, the threat actor now knows that this is a working, functioning, phone number, and the attack goes from there, right? And so I think that's really interesting. And I think in terms of, what do businesses do about this? I think it all comes down to training. And I think a large part of basically everything on our list today comes down to user training to some degree. Certainly, there are some other things you can do for different portions of these that we'll talk about shortly. But I think for initial contact fraud, like end users just need to know that, like, hey, if you don't know this person, red flags everywhere. You know what I mean? I don't know if you have any advice other than that, Ramon.
No, I think you're right. And, uh, you know, to maybe go one step further, if I may say it this way, it's about how specific the training can get and can follow this kind of trend, right? Because, okay, people might be aware now about phishing. They are probably aware now in the corporate world. Some people might be aware about spear phishing, but to know about a variation in the evolution, I think that's the one thing. It's a little bit like when you have your driving license, you kind of know how you're supposed to drive when you take the exam. But what about 5 years afterwards, 10 years afterwards?
Right.
Did you get the update? What does that mean on the side of the road? I don't know, right? So it's kind of in a way similar to be sure that users follow the trend because the stakes are really, really high with spear phishing.
Right. Right. For sure. It's definitely an interesting one. I think I mean, it's been around forever, but it continues to be on the list of spear phishing methods, right? So, well, the next one on our list today is good old tax fraud, spear phishing, right? And when we say tax fraud, it's kind of like W-2 fraud. And typically it comes down to situations where either an executive or HR is being impersonated and, like, hey, we need to fill out your tax documents so that you can receive your paycheck next week. I need your social security number or the bank account that you would like stuff wired to, or any other piece of personal information, right? And so the attacker is going to impersonate somebody who would normally be asking for that type of information. Now, the other area where I've seen tax/slash W-2 fraud come into play here, maybe not so much W-2, but more on the tax fraud side, is I don't know how it is in Europe, but I know around tax season here in the US, March, April, May, you see a large increase in the number of like DocuSign impersonations, right? Because a lot of accountancy firms use DocuSign to, hey, sign here for your taxes, right, and stuff like that. And so, kind of comes into play in that area too. But what have you seen over on your side of the ocean there, Ramon?
Yeah, that's a good one because I think this one is really like country specific, as especially in Europe, each country has their own tax season in a way. Some countries actually do not have such thing. I don't know whether, for instance, France, you could say there's such a thing, but I think what's really interesting is that once again, cyber criminals, right? They are moving away from the traditional wire transfer request, and depending on who they are going to target, they are going to use new variations, new techniques to get information. And obviously, it also depends on the kind of information they're looking for. As you mentioned, right, this particular one, it's not necessarily about eventually getting a wire transfer or a gift card, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a few minutes. It's about getting personal information, such as a social or things like that. So it's really interesting because cyber criminals will adapt their techniques depending on their targets as well as the content they want to see. But yeah, to go back to your point, I don't think we're seeing so much in Europe as a whole, and it's going to depend country by country, and also how important in each country, like your tax ID is. Right, in some countries it's not that much of a confidential piece of information. In others it is. But again, cyber criminals will adapt, and I think that's the key there. Once again.
Right, for sure. And you bring up a good point. How that tax ID is more sensitive in some other countries than others. A good friend of mine, Andy Syrewicze, I had on the show a couple weeks ago, as of this recording, maybe last week, depending on when this episode's published. We were talking about the National Public Data Breach, which is it's a data broker, right? And they data brokers, of course, amass vast quantities of personal information, right? Well, this data broker was breached, and all that personal information leaked out into the wild, right? And it's brought up this question in the industry. I've seen this being discussed amongst cybersecurity professionals, privacy advocates over the last couple of weeks now, and that why do countries, mainly my own country, the U.S., why do we continue to use easily abused identity mechanisms like social security numbers, right? Because, I mean, in the case of W-2 fraud or tax fraud that we're talking about in this case, once I have the target's social security number,
Yes.
I probably have their address already. I basically have everything I need to go and open a credit card as them and go open a bank account as them, get a loan. I can cause all kinds of havoc with that information. So it's brought up some interesting conversations in terms of like, should we still be using identity mechanisms like this, right?
Yeah. I think this one is really interesting. You're making a good point because you're going from online impersonation or even email impersonation to, real life impersonation, because with somebody social, you can open a bank account, you can ask for a loan, you can open like a phone line as well. So the multiple things that one can do. So it can have real consequences in the real world really, really, really fast. So that's an interesting and intriguing category for sure.
Yeah. Yep. So next on our list, and I think we've talked about this on this show before. Maybe not you and I, Roman, but I think I'm trying to think of who it was. I think Umut Almdar and I talked about this before briefly, and that is C-suite fraud or CEO fraud or exec fraud, whatever you want to call it. But basically, the whole idea here is exactly what it sounds like. I am going to pose as the CEO or CFO or some leader person of a target organization, trying to get you to do something. And I see this paired with initial contact fraud a lot of the times, like you mentioned, Roman, where like, hey, I'm the CEO, right? Like, hey, Roman, I'm in a really urgent business meeting, and we have an urgent bill that needs to be taken care of. I need you to wire $80,000 to this checking account, that type of thing. And it surprises me. I shouldn't be surprised anymore. I keep saying that on the show, but it surprises me how often this works still.
Yes. Yes. And if you allow me the comparison, I think in English you say this one is the OG, right?
Right.
Uh, uh, because that's the kind of the first one we were seeing in terms of spear phishing attempts categories. And to your point, absolutely. Now we're seeing like initial contact as the step one, and this one still as the step two. Once they've established a channel of communication with their target, but yeah, even in some cases, hackers will go, straight for it, all in, and it may work because once again, it comes down to the level of education on the one side, and another aspect actually, and I think this one we've talked about it as well is processes, right? Because
Yeah.
even if somebody gets tricked, if there are processes within the company to prevent wire transfer fraud, because that's essentially what those refer to with those attempts, like it's about wire transfer often, then company may be saved. In other instances, if they don't have either education or processes, then fraud is going to
Yeah.
happen.
For sure, for sure. And it was during my my in the trenches MSP days of my career, I actually came across attempted C-suite fraud one time,
Mm.
and it was a case where the alleged CEO sent an email to the CFO and basically the example I just gave, like, hey, we have this urgent bill. I need you to wire $70,000. I think was the amount to this, to this account.
Yes.
And you mentioned processes. Processes saved their bacon in this case because the CFO was thought to himself, like, you know what, like, this is not normally how we do this. Like, this is not the standard process for transferring money. So he gets up, walks across the hallway, pokes his head in the CEO's door and says, hey, what's going on with this invoice? To which the CEO says, what invoice? And then the whole thing falls apart from there. um yep. So it's, sorry, go ahead.
No, no, no. I was going to say, and I was trying to remember that was in the IDC IC3 report from the this
Yes.
FBI agency, and they were like, so BEC, right, which is in a way another name for spear phishing or user impersonation,
Yep.
really takes I think you said takes the cake in English in terms of
Yeah.
the losses it generates, like far greater or higher losses than ransomware, for instance. And yet we keep on talking about ransomware all the time. And so to go back to this particular category, so this one has been around there for so many years, and yet some companies still fall. I'm wondering, like, so we the community, we need to talk much more about the risks of spear phishing, because this is really like the number one threat right now.
Right. For sure. And I mean, it's from a like a security scanning perspective, these attacks aren't even something that like your traditional security scanner is going to catch because there's no malicious code, there's no malicious attachment. As far as the scanning engine is concerned, this is a legit message, right? And really, it comes down to social engineering, is what ultimately what it is at the end of the day.
Yeah, so for our security vendors, it makes it really really difficult. And obviously, there have been some technologies now out there for a while, especially in the
Yep.
on the AI side of things. But on the flip side, for a cyber criminal, you just need to be a scammer with an email address. You don't need any technical skills. So the
Yep.
entry barrier is very very low. You just look up online people and people information. You create a Gmail account or any email account. Don't want to name names, and then you're good to go.
Yep, for sure. So yeah, I mean, processes comes down to that, and I mean, comes down to stopping this and letting employees know that, like, hey, the CEO or the CFO leadership will never contact you via WhatsApp, or they will never ask you to do this function outside of the standard process, right? So it all comes down to training again and process on that one. So interesting. So I've got three more on my list here, Romain. I've got lawyer fraud to talk about. I've got banking fraud and gift card fraud. These ones are a little bit more, I mean, they've been around for a while, but they're a little bit more unique in terms of, the spear phishing attempts. Lawyer fraud is the next on my list. And this one's kind of interesting. And lawyer fraud, basically, again, sounds exactly what it sounds like, the impersonation of lawyers or law firms. And the I see this used in a couple of different ways. Um, one way is how do I want to say it? Kind of through like bullying tactics, in that, oh hey, so and so, because of this lawsuit, your company owes us damages of $20,000. But if you pay it today, we'll settle for $10,000. Right? Um, exactly, and that's like, you know they're trying to play on the fear angle, and it appears like they're giving you a break by paying early, right? And so, I mean, a lot of this goes back to the typical con man stuff, right? But that stuff works via this medium as well too, right? And I guess the other things that kind of fall into the lawyer fraud category would be impersonating a lawyer themselves for the purpose of gathering personal information, and things like that. And what's interesting about this is, I said at the beginning of this episode, we looked at two different groups. We looked at enterprises specifically, and then we looked at all companies, which includes enterprises and all other businesses. We found that lawyer fraud was only in the top 5 in the enterprise category. It was not in the top 5 for all businesses. And well, that's one of the things we looked at, right? Was why is that? And so, I'll let you dive into that, Romain. I've been talking. I'll let you get a word in here
Yeah,
edgewise.
I mean, thank you, Andy. Well, so we thought about it, we made some research, and there are at least two reasons behind that. Number one is, as larger enterprises have more, security solutions, more staff, and deliver more training, they're less likely to fall for more entry-level spear phishing, right? So spear phishers, cyber criminals have to be more crafty. So they will be more specific. So that's a reason. Another reason is, obviously, in larger organization, the enterprise space, they're more likely to work with law firms, it's M&A,
Yep.
it's litigations, than, I say in English, a mom and pop shop, if it's a small family office, local factory, they're less likely. So if one day this kind of smaller business receives an email from a lawyer, they're going to be like, we don't have any lawyers, so what's going on? We haven't had any
Right.
litigation ever. Whereas in the enterprise space, like, probably have more relationships, business ongoing with law firms. So those are two reasons likely behind this, difference between the enterprise space and the rest of the companies in terms of spear phishing categories.
Right. Yep, for sure. And I mean, again, I'm trying to kind of circle back with each of these, and like, okay, how would an organization stop this, right? And again, process
Yes.
and training.
Yeah.
Like, that is the reoccurring thing here, is process and training. I mean, employees that might receive these types of messages would be anyone with access to money, anyone in HR, leadership. They should all know that, like, hey, if I'm receiving some sort of legal request or communication, what law firm is it going to be coming from?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
person is it going to be coming from? And what's the process for receiving official communications from those entities and people, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Training processes, those are absolutely key for this kind of
Yep.
spear phishing
Indeed.
attempts. Yep.
Indeed. So the next one on my list is banking fraud. And of course, this is kind of the theme here, exactly what it sounds like, right? The whole thing around banking fraud is to get access to money and or the information needed for financial transactions. And so, not unusual to see it in the top 5 spear phishing categories. What is very interesting in our findings is that, again, comparing the two groups, enterprises and then all companies, banking fraud was not in the top 5 for the enterprise space. And it all comes back to process, right? Because, you mentioned mom and pop shops. It might be somebody's husband or wife doing all of the banking stuff. It might be a family member or a friend, whereas an enterprise with thousands of users and building, not thousands of buildings, but multiple buildings and locations, there's going to be very strict, regimented processes for
Yes,
anything
yes,
to do
yes,
with
exactly.
money.
Yeah, and I was thinking about like even in small town, everybody there's just one accountant, and even like when somebody's going to read the email, it's going to be like, hey, that's not how John typically write me emails. That tone is so weird, like so formal. That can't be John, right? Even the small things are going to be dead giveaways.
Yeah.
Whereas to your point, in larger organizations, like you don't know, there's just so many people involved potentially. So it's not that it's going to be 100% hit rate, but it's more likely to succeed. That's an interesting approach. Again, narrowing down the attack, the content, the payload in a way to your target.
Yep, for sure. And it's funny you mentioned that, those mannerisms, those behaviors, when you work with somebody on the regular, like an accountant. I think of my own accountant, and like that guy, I mean, when I get an email from him, it's like 4 words, like 5 words. I mean, just like super brief, straight to the point. And yeah, I can imagine like somebody trying to impersonate him, like, oh, hey, like putting sentences together. And I'm like you said, the first thing I'm going to say is like, that's not him. That's not normally. So yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up, Ramon. So again, processes and training. Now, the last one I have on my list, and I say this one for last for a very specific reason. I've got gift card fraud here. And why did I save gift card fraud for last? Well, we found, again, we looked at the 3 summer months here of 2024. Gift card fraud was the top spear phishing attack across both groups, for the enterprise and for all businesses. And I found that interesting for a couple of reasons, right? Typically, you associate gift card fraud with more personal, like individual phishing attacks. So, like, not necessarily going after a business, but a person. Because you always hear about those stories. Maybe it's just me where I sit. My wife works for a library system here in the U.S., and I quite frequently, in their library system, they run into situations where, senior citizens, older people are, they're at the library asking, how do I get gift card X, right? Like they're right in the midst of a gift card scam, basically, right? Thankfully, they catch a lot of these, but it's very common at the individual level. So, with that in mind, I was really surprised to see that it was number one for businesses as well, according to our data. And so, why is that, right? And the one case that I've run into in my travels is at the business side is like the case of a sales executive allegedly contacting, HR or whatever department handles the procurement of goods. This impersonated sales executive saying, "Hey, I'd like to give out, like some goodies, some gifts to my top 10 sales performers. Can you procure $2,000 gift cards and send the digital codes to me so I can do that?" That's gift cards fraud, right? That's the one case I've actually seen. I don't know if there's any that come to mind that are top of mind for you, Ramon.
Yeah, no, I think it's the ones we've seen that generally revolve around rewarding employees, right, or business partners. And I think it speaks to two things. One, adaptability from spearfishers. What's the most likely to succeed now, right? A
Right,
$10,000 wire transfer request, or you know, 5 $100 gift card requests. Well, because there are also likely fewer processes around gift cards request, right? It's not going to go through the whole finance department, and
right.
accounting team is not necessarily going to review it, so it's more likely to succeed. Yes, the potential revenue is smaller, but it's more likely to be there. So that's why there's this incentive. And again, it's about variation, right? Now everybody's more or less suspect, or more people, I should say, are more suspicious around wire transfer requests. Whereas this one, not so much. So that's why I can see it being successful across the board. And again, especially in larger enterprises, right? Maybe this is like a commodity gift card for various reasons. So just one more request. Why this one should not get through? Uh, Assuming, right? So I
Right.
understand why it's so popular now. The potential loss is not so high, but it's still a successful money generating vehicle for cyber criminals.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, depending on the organization size and structure, I mean, like 5, 10, 20, $100 gift cards may not even register as a blip on anyone's radar.
That's true. That's
You know,
absolutely true. Yeah.
I mean, you think about your, multi-thousand, mega enterprises, and I mean, like, $2,000, like they blink and spend that much. You know what I
Yes.
mean? So
Yes.
yeah,
That's a
to your
very good
point.
point.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it really ties in with that, right? More people are aware of the wire transfer fraud stuff like that now, but the gift card stuff, not so much. And uh, the feedback and the suggestion that I always give, especially to family members, is like if somebody contacts you and or contacts you directly, or somebody's asking for payment in gift cards, like just run away.
Yeah.
like no good can come of
Yes.
that. You know what I
Yes.
mean? So, anyway, well, I think that does it for our list. Anything you want to add before we wrap up here, Aman?
Yeah, thanks again, Andy. And I think what's interesting is like what's ahead of us, right? And as we've looked at like top trends, some things we've already seen now for a while for some of them, and not so much for others in terms of BEC trends. One is what we call the payroll fraud, right? So
Yep.
targeting at the HR department, impersonating uh, employees around the 15th, 20th of the month, right before HR process the pay. That's very
Yep.
smart, and now it's like a almost a mundane spear phishing attack as well. And the other one, which was identified by some of our security specialists here in the team, was actually a fully generated conversation between two parties which had never existed. And one was a so-called charity uh, that actually was like the cyber criminal, and the other one was allegedly like the CFO, and eventually the charity person forwarded a fake thread conversing with the CFO to like lower rank finance employee, asking, say, hey, your boss told me he's going to sponsor our gala, so please, here comes the finance information. So while this is still simple, just an email, cyber criminals are crafty, and we're likely to see more of these in the future.
For sure. I got to give them props for ingenuity. That's for sure.
Yeah, very, very smart and clever and creative for sure.
I
But don't do this
I've
at
said this
home.
right, exactly, and I've mentioned this multiple times on this show. Is like, so I swear, threat actor brains just they work differently. I mean, they do things that wouldn't even occur to me. Maybe that's because I'm not a criminal, right? But like, it's just anyway. Interesting times we live in,
Yep.
right? Well, Ramon, I want to thank you for spending some time to come and share
Thank you,
your
Andy.
knowledge and insights. It's always good having you on the show, my friend.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you, everyone. Talk to you soon.
Yep, yep. And those of you watching, thanks for spending some time with us today. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to smash that like and subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. Otherwise, you can find us on all the major podcasting platforms. With that, we'll let you get back to your day. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you again next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Have a good one.